The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under the hot sun, a land of dust, rocks, and stubborn life that refused to yield to the harshness of the climate. In the year 1881, this rugged landscape was home to a town unlike any other, Tombstone. It was a place built on silver, ambition, and a hunger for opportunity. People came from all over, drawn by the promise of wealth and a chance to escape their pasts. But with opportunity came danger. Tombstone was a town where fortunes could be made in a day, and lives could be lost just as quickly. It was a town with no mercy for the weak and no patience for those who could not defend themselves. The streets of Tombstone were a mixture of chaos and charm. Wooden buildings lined the dusty roads, their facades decorated with signs promising gambling, whiskey, and lodging. Saloon doors swung open with a creak whenever someone entered or left, and the sounds of laughter, shouting, and music often mingled with the clang of horse hooves on wooden planks. Miners, cowboys, gamblers, and businessmen all mingled in the crowded streets, each chasing their own dreams or running from their own troubles. It was a town alive with energy. But beneath the excitement lay a tension that never seemed to fade. Every glance, every footstep, carried a hint of danger, and every man knew that a single misstep could cost him his life. It was in this tense environment that stories of a mysterious figure began to circulate. The man was known as Tomas Apache Hearttaker Navarro, a name that inspired both fear and fascination. No one knew exactly where he had come from, though whispers suggested he had survived battles during the Apache Wars and had learned the ways of the desert from a young age. His presence was more than a rumor, though people spoke of his strikes, his cunning, and the eerie pattern that followed him. He was said to act at noon, moving like a shadow under the glaring sun, taking revenge on those he believed had wronged him or others. The noon curse, the townsfolk called it, though none could explain why he chose that exact time. The legend of Tomas spread quickly because the townspeople had little else to capture their attention besides the constant struggles for survival. Stories were shared in saloons over whiskey and in the streets where miners rested after long, grueling days in the silver mines. Mothers whispered warnings to their children, telling them to stay inside when the sun reached its highest point. Even the lawmen, who were supposed to maintain order, felt a shiver run down their spines whenever the name Apache Hearttaker was mentioned. To some, he was a specter of vengeance, a man who punished the corrupt and reminded people that injustice could never be hidden. To others, he was a villain, a figure who brought death where there should have been peace. Tomas himself was a figure of mystery. He rarely stayed in one place for long, disappearing into the desert, with the ease of someone who knew every rock, canyon, and hidden path. Those who claimed to have seen him described a man who moved silently, almost like the wind itself. His eyes were sharp, always observing, and his expression revealed little. He was not known for talking or forming attachments. His work was solitary, precise, and, according to legend, almost ritualistic. Each action he took seemed carefully planned, and the consequences were left behind for others to discover. The town of Tombstone, meanwhile, went about its daily routines, trying to ignore the shadow looming over them. Merchants tended their shops, selling goods to anyone with the coin to pay. Blacksmiths hammered iron in their forges, the sparks flying like tiny stars against the backdrop of the dusty streets. Children ran and played in alleyways, their laughter bright but fragile, always under the watchful eyes of cautious parents. Yet, even amidst this ordinary life, there was a collective unease. Everyone knew that at any moment the noon curse could strike, and no one was truly safe. Among the townspeople, a few brave or perhaps foolish souls attempted to understand the man behind the legend. They wanted to catch a glimpse of him, to see if he was a demon, a man, or something else entirely. But Tomas was clever, always staying one step ahead. He left behind signs, perhaps as a warning or a message, and the pattern of his actions only added to the fear surrounding him. No posse, no trap, and no lawman could predict where or when he would appear. This unpredictability made him both terrifying and fascinating. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the town grew quieter. Saloon doors remained closed, and the usual bustle of the streets slowed. People retreated indoors, hiding behind curtains or peering through windows. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the desert itself recognized the approach of the fateful hour. Noon in Tombstone was no longer just a time of day. It had become a symbol of uncertainty, of the invisible threat that hovered just beyond sight. In the midst of this tension, a few stories emerged about the origins of the noon curse. Some claimed that Tomas's anger was rooted in the loss of his family during the wars, while others said it was the injustices he witnessed against his people that shaped his mission. These stories painted him as a man driven by a sense of duty, a guardian of justice in a world that often ignored the weak and punished the innocent. Whether fact or folklore, these tales spread like wildfire, adding depth and complexity to his legend. Yet, despite the fear he inspired, Tomas was not simply a figure of death. He was also a man of skill and intelligence. Observers noted his ability to survive in harsh environments, to navigate the treacherous deserts without leaving a trace. He was a master of strategy, choosing his moments carefully and understanding the psychology of those around him. This intelligence, combined with his reputation, made him almost untouchable. Many who attempted to confront him were met with failure, leaving their tales as warnings for others. As the hours passed and the sun inched toward its zenith, the atmosphere in Tombstone grew heavier. People whispered in hushed tones, and even the bravest felt a shiver run down their spines. The noon curse was not just a threat. It was a reminder of the unpredictability of life in the wild territories of Arizona. In this town, where law and order were fragile and personal vendettas could erupt at any moment, the arrival of a single man could change everything. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the streets were nearly empty. Horses pawed quietly in stables, and the distant sound of a hammer striking iron echoed from a blacksmith's shop. Inside homes and saloons, windows were tightly shut, and doors were bolted. The people of Tombstone waited, hearts pounding, as they knew the legend of the Apache heart-taker would not remain a story for long. His presence, whether near or far, cast a shadow over the town, a shadow that was both frightening and strangely compelling. And so, life in Tombstone continued, a mixture of hope, ambition, and fear. People carried on with their work, but the noon curse lingered in their minds like a silent drumbeat, a rhythm that reminded them of a lawless world where survival depended on vigilance and courage. The desert outside the town waited patiently, as if holding its breath for what was to come, and somewhere beyond the edges of Tombstone, moving silently under the blazing sun, was Tomas Navarro, the man who would come to be known as the Apache heart-taker, a shadow in the desert whose story was only beginning to unfold. The town of Tombstone continued to buzz with activity, but beneath its lively surface, tension had begun to thicken like the heat of the midday sun. Stories of the Apache heart-taker, Tomas Navarro, had spread through every saloon, general store, and mining camp. Every conversation seemed to circle back to him, whether whispered in fear or spoken with awe. For some, he was a shadow of vengeance, a man who punished wrongdoers when the law could not. For others, he was a threat, a reminder that the world was unpredictable, and justice often came at the edge of a blade. Regardless of how people felt, they all knew one thing: he was a man who should not be underestimated. Tomas Navarro was not born into notoriety. His early years were shaped by hardship and loss. As a young boy, he had witnessed the destruction of his village during the Apache Wars. Families were scattered, homes burned, and the land he had known as safe became a place of constant danger. Orphaned and alone, he learned quickly that survival required intelligence, patience, and courage. He became skilled at moving silently through forests and deserts, reading the land, tracking others, and disappearing without a trace. These lessons, born of tragedy, formed the foundation for the man he would become. As he grew, Tomas realized that the world was divided between those who used power for themselves and those who suffered quietly. He witnessed corrupt lawmen taking advantage of minors, greedy businessmen cheating workers, and men who would harm the innocent to serve their own desires. The injustice left a deep mark on him, fueling a sense of purpose that was both personal and moral. He became determined to right wrongs in the only way he knew how, through precision, stealth, and, when necessary, force. Yet, he did not see himself as a villain. In his mind, he was delivering justice where none existed. By the time he arrived in Tombstone, Tomas had built a reputation that was as much legend as reality. He moved silently through the deserts and hills, appearing where least expected. Witnesses spoke of a man who seemed almost a part of the land itself, silent, fast, and deadly. When he struck, it was calculated, never random. Those who encountered him often survived only because he chose not to harm them. A decision that left townsfolk debating whether he was cruel or merciful. The stories of his actions spread quickly, fueled by the townspeople's fascination with a figure who seemed larger than life. Despite his fearsome reputation, Tomas was not without compassion. He had a code of honor that guided his actions. He avoided harming the innocent and targeted only those who were guilty of wrongdoing. Yet even his acts of justice were terrifying to those who did not understand him. Bodies left in the desert or in the outskirts of town were arranged in ways that carried messages, symbols of warning or justice, meant to teach lessons to those who thought they were untouchable. For the people of Tombstone, these acts were both a warning and a mystery. No one could predict where or when he would appear, and this unpredictability kept the town in constant suspense. Among Tombstone's residents, the reactions to Tomas varied widely. Some admired him secretly, seeing in his actions a reflection of the justice they wished existed in the world. These individuals whispered stories of his clever escapes and the way he seemed to outsmart those who sought to harm others. Others feared him deeply, locking doors and hiding indoors when the sun approached noon. Even the lawmen, who were supposed to maintain order, felt powerless against a man who knew the land better than anyone and who could vanish into the desert as easily as the wind. Tomas's arrival in Tombstone coincided with a period of heightened tension. The town was already divided by rivalries between miners, businessmen, and lawmen. Every small conflict carried the potential to escalate into violence. When the name of the Apache heart-taker appeared in conversation, it added fuel to the fire. Townsfolk speculated about his intentions. Would he come for the corrupt businessmen, the dishonest lawmen, or someone else entirely? Nobody knew, and that uncertainty was more frightening than any direct threat. Despite his presence, Tomas Navarro remained a ghost. He appeared in glimpses, shadows in alleyways, or as a figure at the edge of the desert. Some claimed to have seen him moving silently across rooftops. Others said he vanished into thin air. These stories, true or exaggerated, added to the aura surrounding him. People began to believe he was unstoppable, almost supernatural in his skill and timing. The noon curse became more than a rumor. It became a part of the town's reality. The effect on Tombstone was profound. Saloon owners shuttered their doors at midday, worried that any wrong move might draw his attention. Miners paused in the shafts, listening to distant sounds in the desert. Children were kept inside, and families spoke in hushed tones about the mysterious man who punished wrongdoers with precision. The noon curse became a rhythm of fear and caution, a reminder that life in Tombstone was fragile and unpredictable. Every hour leading to noon was filled with anticipation and anxiety. Tomas's presence also began to influence the town's social and political dynamics. Rivalries that had existed quietly for years became more pronounced, as some individuals tried to align themselves with or against him. Some saw him as a potential ally, a force that could remove competitors or enemies. Others viewed him as a threat that could destabilize their carefully built lives. His reputation alone shifted the balance of power. Even without him being physically present, the town was caught in a delicate dance between fear, admiration, and uncertainty, all orchestrated by a man who rarely appeared and never stayed long. Even in the shadows, Tomas observed the town closely. He watched the interactions, the disputes, and the corrupt deals, carefully noting those who needed correction. While the townsfolk lived their daily lives, he moved through the landscape with precision, unseen, and almost untouchable. Every step he took was deliberate, every decision weighed, and every action designed to send a message. His intelligence was as formidable as his skill with weapons or survival in the desert. He understood the human mind, using fear, rumor, and perception as tools as much as arrows or bullets. The legend of Tomas Navarro also began to intersect with the arrival of other figures in Tombstone. Lawmen like Wyatt Earp and men like Doc Holliday were making their way to the town, bringing their own reputations and conflicts with them. Although Tomas had his own path, the presence of these men would soon create a complex web of tension and confrontation. Even without direct interaction, his actions and reputation influenced how others perceived the town and each other. His shadow loomed over events before he even appeared, setting the stage for conflicts that would shape Tombstone's history. As the weeks passed, the noon curse became ingrained in the town's consciousness. It was no longer just a story. It was part of daily life. Shopkeepers adjusted their schedules, miners altered their routines, and even travelers approaching the town were warned to be cautious. The desert itself seemed to carry a sense of awareness, a quiet acknowledgement of the man who moved within it. Tomas Navarro had become more than a person. He was a force, a presence that reminded everyone that justice, vengeance, and survival could intersect in unexpected ways. By the end of the second part of the story, it was clear that Tombstone would never be the same. The Apache heart-taker, with his skill, intelligence, and code of honor, had become a symbol of both fear and respect. His background, shaped by loss and survival, made him a complex figure, not easily categorized as hero or villain. The town itself had changed in response to him, its people living cautiously but also with a heightened awareness of morality, courage, and consequence. Tomas Navarro had arrived as a shadow, a figure from the desert, but he was now a force that could not be ignored. His legend would continue to grow, each act building upon the last, each appearance deepening the mystery. The townspeople understood one undeniable truth: the Apache heart-taker was coming. And when he did, everything in Tombstone would be touched by his presence. Whether for justice, vengeance, or the whims of fate, his story was just beginning. And the desert waited patiently, as silent and vast as the man who had learned to move within it. The desert sun rose higher in the sky, and the town of Tombstone felt the weight of its presence like a living thing. Every building, street, and alley seemed to hold its breath as the day inched toward noon. For the townspeople, the approach of this hour was always uneasy. It was more than just a time of day. It carried the invisible power of the noon curse, the shadow of Tomas Navarro that had stretched across Tombstone for weeks. Whispers filled the streets, carried from one shopkeeper to another, from saloon to hotel, as people shared stories of the strange and terrifying patterns that accompanied him. Tomas Navarro had a rhythm to his actions, one that had become as predictable as it was terrifying. Always at noon, he struck, leaving behind a signature that could not be ignored. The methods were never the same, yet always precise. Some townspeople described finding evidence of his presence in ways that were almost ritualistic. A broken lock, a trail of blood leading into the desert, or a message carved into a tree or wall. Each act seemed to carry meaning. A silent message to the corrupt, the greedy, or those who had harmed the innocent. And yet, he always left no witnesses, no trace of his full presence, only the aftermath of his carefully planned strikes. The pattern of the noon curse had a psychological effect that extended beyond those directly involved. Saloon owners shuttered their doors, miners left work early, and families kept children inside. Even the bravest men paused their daily routines, listening to the wind for signs of movement in the desert. The fear was palpable, a heavy, invisible weight pressing down on Tombstone. People spoke of him in hushed tones, some with admiration, others with terror. They could not deny that he had a strange sense of justice, punishing wrongdoers when no lawman could. Yet his unpredictability made him a threat that could reach anyone at any time. Despite the growing fear, some individuals were drawn to Tomas's story. They sought him out, not for violence, but for understanding. Who was this man who could move through the desert like a ghost, strike with precision, and vanish without a trace? What had shaped him into the Apache heart-taker? These questions, asked quietly over whiskey or shared in secret meetings, only added to the legend. Tomas Navarro had become a figure larger than life. A man whose actions inspired both fear and fascination. The man himself remained ever observant, moving silently through the outskirts of Tombstone and the surrounding desert. His eyes scanned the town for signs of corruption, injustice, or danger. He watched the interactions of the townspeople, noting arguments, unfair trades, and acts of cruelty. Every detail mattered to him. Every slight injustice, a potential target for his attention. Yet, he was patient. He waited for the right moment, calculating the consequences of every action. Noon was not just a time for attack, it was a symbol, a warning, and a stage for the precision that defined him. Stories circulated of those who had encountered him. One miner claimed to have seen Tomas moving across the desert floor, without making a sound, disappearing into the shadows before the man could even react. Another reported a message left on the door of a corrupt saloon owner, a simple symbol that warned of justice to come. These stories spread quickly, each retelling adding more drama and tension. The Noon Curse became more than a pattern. It became a test of courage, intelligence, and morality for the town. The townspeople began to notice subtle changes in their routines. Children no longer played freely in the streets during the morning hours, and adults avoided the usual gathering spots. Merchants and shopkeepers planned their deliveries to avoid being caught in the open at noon. Even travelers passing through were warned to remain indoors during the peak of the sun. The town was adapting to the presence of a single man, allowing his reputation to shape behavior even without direct contact. This psychological influence was as powerful as any physical threat, and it demonstrated the mastery Tomas Navarro had over perception and fear. But the Apache heart-taker was not merely a figure of fear. Behind the acts of vengeance lay intelligence, strategy, and a careful moral code. He did not kill indiscriminately. Innocent townspeople were rarely harmed. And those who were caught in his plans were usually part of the corruption or injustice that had consumed Tombstone. His acts were deliberate, intended to teach lessons rather than cause chaos for its own sake. In this way, he was not just a criminal or outlaw, he was a force of retribution. A man whose moral compass, though unconventional, guided his actions with precision. As the days passed, the tension in Tombstone grew. People became more vigilant, sharing stories and warnings to protect themselves. The Noon Curse became an invisible clock, ticking down to moments of fear and anticipation. Each day, someone would spot a figure at the edge of the desert, or notice signs of Tomas's movements, a horse seen in the distance, footprints leading into the sand, or an arrangement of objects meant to signal his arrival. The town had learned to read these signs, yet they could not predict the exact time or manner of his actions. The mystery surrounding him intensified the suspense, making every encounter a story in itself. Tomas Navarro's presence also exposed the weaknesses in Tombstone's social structure. Corruption and greed, once hidden in the shadows, were now revealed through his actions. Business owners who cheated miners or lawmen who turned a blind eye to crime found themselves in his path. The Apache heart-taker became a mirror for the town, reflecting its flaws and reminding its citizens that actions have consequences. In this way, he was not just a man to be feared, he was a symbol of accountability, even if delivered through fear and precision. At the same time, rivalries within Tombstone intensified. The townspeople began to align themselves based on perceived alliances with or against Tomas. Some tried to curry favor, believing his approval might protect them. Others plotted ways to trap him or use his reputation for personal gain. This web of tension created opportunities for both heroism and deceit, as people navigated their fears while seeking advantage. The town had become a stage, with every citizen playing a role in the unfolding drama of the Noon Curse. The approach of noon on any given day became a moment of collective suspense. Shops closed, doors were bolted, and even the wind seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. The sun climbed relentlessly, casting sharp shadows across the town, and the people waited, tense and alert. Mothers pulled children inside. Men paused in the streets, and travelers who had heard the stories, whispered prayers, or words of caution. The noon curse was no longer just a legend, it had become a living reality, a rhythm that shaped the daily lives of everyone in Tombstone. And yet, amid the fear, some could not help but admire Tomas Navarro. His intelligence, skill, and moral code inspired a mixture of awe and respect. He was a man who had survived impossible odds, mastered the desert, and maintained a code of justice that few understood. The combination of courage, cunning, and principle made him a figure who could not be easily categorized as hero or villain. His actions challenged people to think, to question, and to reconsider the meaning of justice in a world where law was fragile and survival uncertain. As the days of suspense stretched on, Tomas prepared for what would become one of his most daring actions. He had observed the town, understood its routines, and noted the individuals whose actions had caused harm. Every detail mattered, and his calculations were precise. He waited for the perfect moment, knowing that his approach would leave a lasting mark on Tombstone. The noon curse, which had haunted the town for weeks, was about to reach its peak, and the consequences of his next move would echo far beyond the immediate streets of Tombstone. By the end of this part of the story, it was clear that Tomas Navarro was no ordinary man. His intelligence, skill, and moral code had transformed him into a figure of legend, whose presence could shape the lives and decisions of everyone in the town. The noon curse had become both a warning and a symbol, a rhythm of fear and anticipation that demanded attention. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge the townspeople's courage, morality, and understanding of justice. Tombstone, with its wooden streets, saloons, and dusty alleys, waited silently. The sun climbed toward its zenith, and the town felt the approaching presence of a man who moved like a shadow, struck like lightning, and vanished without a trace. Tomas Navarro, the Apache heart-taker, was preparing for another act that would deepen his legend, test the people of Tombstone, and leave the town forever marked by the noon curse. The desert outside waited patiently, as it had for centuries, for the story to unfold, and the town braced itself for the inevitable collision between fear, justice, and legend. The sun blazed mercilessly over Tombstone, turning the wooden streets and buildings into a stage of light and shadow. The townspeople went about their business with a heightened sense of alertness, each movement cautious and deliberate. The noon curse had become a constant in their lives, an invisible hand guiding their actions and decisions. Shops closed early, children were kept indoors, and even the loudest saloons seemed to whisper with tension. Everyone knew that Tomas Navarro, the Apache heart-taker, moved unseen, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and this knowledge weighed heavily on every heart. Meanwhile, beyond the dusty streets, the desert stretched endlessly, as patient and unyielding as ever. Tomas had observed the town for days, noting routines, patterns, and vulnerabilities. His eyes were sharp, scanning for weakness or corruption. He did not move recklessly. Every step was calculated, every decision deliberate. The desert had taught him patience and stealth, skills that he now applied with precision. Today, he intended to execute one of his most daring plans, one that would challenge the town's courage and test the limits of the noon curse. The arrival of new figures in Tombstone added to the tension. Wyatt Earp, the lawman known for his calm demeanor and sharp instincts, had come with the reputation of a man who upheld justice, often in unconventional ways. Alongside him was Doc Holliday, a man whose skill with a gun was matched only by his sharp wit and complex personality. Though they had not yet met Tomas Navarro, his presence in the town influenced their perception of danger and strategy. Rumors of the Apache heart-taker had reached them, and they knew that Tombstone was a town where law, greed, and violence intersected in dangerous ways. Inside the saloons and businesses, whispers grew louder. Miners spoke of the patterns of the noon curse, describing the messages left by Tomas and the careful precision of his strikes. Merchants shared observations of the desert's edge, noting any unusual movement or shadow that might signal his approach. The town was on edge, a community united by fear and fascination, bound together by the invisible rhythm of the noon curse. Every clock ticked louder, every shadow stretched longer, As people braced for the inevitable, Tomas Navarro moved like a shadow through the outskirts, careful to remain unseen. His knowledge of the terrain was unmatched. Every hill, canyon, and hidden path was familiar to him. He observed the town, noting not just the corrupt, but also those who were innocent, who worked and struggled daily to survive in a harsh and often unfair world. His moral code guided him as much as his skill, shaping decisions that would leave lasting consequences. He planned to strike, but he also planned to leave messages, reminders of accountability, symbols that would be understood by those who had caused harm. As the sun climbed, tension built to a near breaking point. Noon approached, and the streets emptied further. Doors were bolted, and curtains were drawn. The townspeople, though frightened, were also fascinated. They understood that what was about to occur was part of a larger story, a story of skill, courage, and morality played out in a town where law and justice often fell short. Even the bravest men could not ignore the feeling that the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the actions of one man to unfold. When the hour arrived, Tomas moved with unmatched precision. His approach was quiet, almost imperceptible, and yet deliberate. He had chosen a target carefully, a corrupt saloon owner known for cheating miners and intimidating the weaker citizens. Tomas's plan was meticulous, leaving no room for error. As he entered the town unseen, the streets seemed to shift subtly, as if the town itself recognized the arrival of the Apache heart-taker. Every step was measured, every movement part of a carefully executed strategy that would leave a lasting impression. Inside the saloon, the owner was oblivious, counting coins and plotting his next exploit. Tomas, unseen, observed the scene, noting the reactions of everyone present. His eyes were sharp, calculating the best approach. Then, in a series of movements so swift that few could follow, he left his mark. A message carved into the wooden bar, a symbol of warning and justice. The saloon owner, upon discovering it moments later, would understand immediately that the noon curse had arrived and that the man behind it was both skilled and relentless. Outside, the town felt the impact of his presence even without direct confrontation. People reported seeing shadows move at the edge of the streets, hearing footsteps that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The precision of his actions created a ripple of fear and fascination that spread through Tombstone. Merchants, miners, and travelers alike were reminded of the power of one man who could command attention without speaking, leaving messages that carried weight far beyond the immediate moment. The arrival of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday further complicated the situation. They had been tracking tensions in Tombstone, aware of rivalries and disputes. But the presence of Tomas Navarro added a layer of unpredictability. Earp, with his experience in law enforcement, understood the need for caution, strategy, and observation. Holliday, with his sharp instincts and reputation for daring, recognized the challenge presented by a man who combined skill, intelligence, and moral code in equal measure. Though they had not yet encountered him directly, the Apache heart-taker's actions had already influenced their approach to the town, its people, and the conflicts that awaited. By the end of the day, the noon curse had reached its peak. Tomas Navarro had executed his plan with precision, leaving messages and symbols that would resonate with the townspeople for years to come. The saloon owner, once arrogant and cruel, now understood the weight of accountability. Miners and merchants, previously divided by greed and rivalry, observed the power of precision, patience, and skill. The town had been tested, and though fear remained, there was also a sense of awe. The Apache heart-taker did not linger. As quickly as he had arrived, he vanished into the desert, leaving Tombstone to process the impact of his actions. The rhythm of the noon curse, the pattern that had guided his movements, continued to echo in the minds of those who had witnessed or learned of his deeds. Even without a direct confrontation, he had shaped the town's awareness, forcing people to reflect on justice, courage, and morality. This confrontation, though indirect, set the stage for the future. The Earps, Holliday, and other figures in Tombstone would now face a town influenced by the presence of a man who challenged the conventional understanding of law and order. Tomas Navarro's actions were a reminder that justice could take many forms, that skill and intelligence could outweigh brute force, and that fear, when combined with precision, could become a tool of accountability. As the sun set over the desert, the town of Tombstone began to return to a fragile calm. The streets slowly filled with people again, though caution remained. Stories of the Apache heart-taker spread through whispered conversations and cautious observations. Some feared he would return. Others admired the careful justice he had delivered. But all understood that the noon curse was more than legend. It was a force that shaped the town, its people, and the events yet to come. By the end of this day, Tombstone had changed. The Apache heart-taker had demonstrated that one man, guided by skill, intelligence, and a moral code, could influence a town, control its rhythm, and leave a legacy that would echo in memory and story. The noon curse was not over. It had only reached one peak, and the desert, silent and patient, awaited the next movement of a man who had learned to survive, strike, and vanish with unmatched precision. Tomas Navarro remained a shadow in the desert, a figure who would continue to challenge perception, morality, and courage. His legend grew with every action, every message left behind, and every observation of his skill. Tombstone, a town of ambition, greed, and danger, had been marked by his presence. The people would carry the memory of the noon curse with them, a reminder that justice, fear, and legend could intersect in unexpected and unforgettable ways. The desert sky turned a brilliant orange as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Tombstone, exhausted from the tension of the day, seemed to hold its breath, unsure if the calm was temporary or if the shadow of the Apache heart-taker still lingered nearby. The noon curse had left its mark on the town, not just in symbols or messages, but in the minds and hearts of its people. Every street, every alley, every shuttered door carried the memory of Tomas Navarro's precise and deliberate actions. The town had survived, but it had been changed forever. Even as evening settled over Tombstone, the impact of Tomas's presence continued to echo. Those who had witnessed his actions, directly or indirectly, spoke quietly to each other, sharing accounts of shadows moving at the edge of vision, messages left in unexpected places, and the feeling of being watched, though no one could see him. Fear mingled with awe. He was a man who had demonstrated that intelligence and skill could rival brute force, and that justice, even when delivered outside the law, could leave a powerful impression. For some, his actions were terrifying. For others, they were a lesson in courage and consequence. The saloon owner who had been the target of Tomas's latest action was humbled, his arrogance replaced with a careful reflection on his past choices. Miners and merchants, once divided by greed and rivalry, now discussed the meaning of responsibility and justice. Families returned to their homes with a heightened awareness of both danger and morality. Even travelers passing through the town could not ignore the stories they had heard. Tombstone had been tested, and the lessons of the noon curse were etched deeply into the fabric of the town. Tomas Navarro himself moved silently through the desert, disappearing into the open space that had shaped him into the man known as the Apache heart-taker. He did not linger in Tombstone because his purpose was not to control or terrorize the town indefinitely. Instead, he operated according to a code, striking with precision and then retreating, leaving only the impression of his presence and the lessons he wished to impart. He had survived the deserts and wars, honed his skills through years of hardship, and understood that his strength lay in unpredictability and knowledge of the land. Even in retreat, his influence continued to shape the town. People spoke of his presence as if he were still watching, a silent reminder that actions have consequences, that injustice cannot go unnoticed, and that courage and morality were measured in more than words. The noon curse, though momentarily concluded for the day, had created a lasting rhythm in Tombstone. It was a reminder that life in the desert was fragile, unpredictable, and shaped by both human choices and the forces of fate. As days passed, Tombstone returned slowly to its routines, but the memory of Tomas Navarro remained alive in every conversation and every cautious glance toward the desert. Merchants adjusted their practices, miners considered the impact of their actions, and families maintained vigilance. The town had learned that survival required awareness, intelligence, and, at times, moral courage. Even the lawmen, including Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, who had arrived to navigate the town's complex tensions, carried with them the awareness that a single man could influence events more profoundly than any force of law. The legend of the Apache Hearttaker began to grow, as stories of his precision, skill, and moral code spread beyond the borders of Tombstone. People spoke of a man who punished wrongdoers with calculated precision, who disappeared into the desert without a trace, and who left messages that carried lessons about justice and consequence. His reputation was a mixture of fear and admiration, a combination that ensured his name would endure. For those who had witnessed his actions, he became both a cautionary tale and a symbol of a higher form of justice that existed outside the conventional laws of men. Tomas Navarro's own reflections were as deliberate as his actions. He understood the power of perception and legend. His presence, whether felt or rumored, influenced the town more than direct confrontation alone could. By acting with skill and moral purpose, he had created a narrative that would endure long after his physical presence had vanished. He moved through the desert with patience, knowing that the story of the Apache Hearttaker would continue to grow, influencing decisions, shaping behavior, and leaving an indelible mark on history. The town of Tombstone also carried forward lessons from the Noon Curse. The people realized that fear could be used wisely, that intelligence and skill were as important as force, and that morality and courage often required careful thought and deliberate action. Even after Tomas Navarro disappeared from their sight, his presence lingered in the form of awareness and reflection. Those who had encountered him, directly or indirectly, understood that life in the desert was fragile, that actions mattered, and that the consequences of wrongdoing could come swiftly and decisively. Over time, the Apache Hearttaker became part of the larger story of Tombstone. His actions occurred just before the famous confrontation at the Corral, but they were already shaping the town's culture, mindset, and sense of justice. People remembered not only the legendary shootouts and rivalries, but also the precise, moral, and terrifying influence of Tomas Navarro. He was a figure who challenged conventional understanding, forcing people to see that justice could take many forms, that intelligence and skill could rival brute force, and that fear, when combined with morality, could become a powerful teacher. Though his physical presence faded, the Apache Hearttaker remained a symbol of accountability and courage. Townspeople continued to share stories, passing lessons from one generation to the next. They spoke of a man who struck at noon, who moved through the desert like a shadow, and who left messages that demanded reflection and respect. These stories became part of the collective memory, shaping the identity of Tombstone and leaving a legacy that would be remembered long after the sun had set over the desert. For Tomas Navarro, the work was never about fame or recognition. His satisfaction came from knowing that his actions had meaning, that they delivered lessons where law and order often failed. He moved silently through the desert, a figure of mystery and precision, understanding that legend itself could be a tool of influence. The Apache Hearttaker had achieved more than fear. He had created awareness, reflection, and an enduring story of justice, courage, and morality. In the quiet moments, the people of Tombstone would sometimes glance toward the distant desert hills, imagining a shadow moving silently across the sand. They would remember the Noon Curse, the precise and deliberate actions, and the moral lessons left behind. Even without direct confrontation, Tomas Navarro had changed the town forever, proving that one man, guided by intelligence, skill, and a personal code of justice, could influence an entire community. As the sun set completely, casting long shadows over the streets of Tombstone, the town settled into a fragile calm. Merchants closed their shops, families returned to their homes, and lawmen reflected on the events that had shaped the day. The desert, as patient and unyielding as ever, held the figure of the Apache Hearttaker in its vast embrace, a silent witness to the story that would continue to unfold. The legend of Tomas Navarro, the Apache Hearttaker, became more than a tale of fear or revenge. It became a story of morality, skill, courage, and the impact that one individual could have on a community. Tombstone had survived the Noon Curse, but the town had also been transformed by it. Its people were more aware, more cautious, and more thoughtful, having been reminded that justice could take many forms, and that actions, both right and wrong, carried consequences. And so, the story of the Apache hearttaker reached its resolution, though not its end. Tomas Navarro remained a shadow in the desert, a figure of mystery whose actions would continue to influence the people of Tombstone and the surrounding lands. The Noon Curse, the legend, and the lessons endured, reminding all who heard the story that courage, intelligence, and morality were forces that could shape history in ways both subtle and profound. Tombstone would eventually move forward, preparing for the challenges and confrontations that lay ahead, including the famous Corral shootout. But the memory of the Apache hearttaker lingered, a reminder that a single man, guided by purpose and skill, could leave a lasting mark on a town, a culture, and the course of history itself. His legacy was not only in fear but in reflection, in the understanding that justice, courage, and morality could exist even in the harshest of deserts. The desert night fell, silent and vast, as if acknowledging the man who had mastered it. The story of Tomas Navarro, the Apache hearttaker, became part of the desert itself, woven into the fabric of the land, the town, and the people who survived its presence. The Noon Curse had ended, at least for now. But the legend endured, carrying with it lessons that would last far beyond the borders of Tombstone, echoing through time as a story of skill, morality, and the power of a single, determined individual.